Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Public Policy Update webinar. My name is Defina Williams. I'm OFN's Chief Public Policy Officer and Head of Government Affairs, so thank you so much for joining us today. Just a few quick housekeeping notes. As usual, we will record and share the presentation out afterwards, so no need to worry about that. You'll have access to the full presentation after we're done. You can also ask your questions using the Q&A function, and you can also connect with your colleagues in the chat box, say hi, get to know each other, and we will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A for questions, but we will answer them at the end of the presentation. So we're actually doing things a little bit different today. We will not be on the call for the entire 2.5 hours that maybe was in the calendar invite, but this will be a little bit longer of a webinar than typical because there's been, number one, a lot of activity in the CDFI policy space that we want to update you on since our last webinar in April. And then we're going to end on something that many of you have been asking for, which are some tips and advice for how to engage in effective advocacy efforts, not just at the federal level, but many of the things we will discuss today will also be relevant to your state and local lobbying efforts. So we have a great presentation lined up for you today, and you're going to hear from everyone on the OFN's policy team. So next slide, dive into the agenda. So today we're going to start with an update on our policy priorities and other happenings around DC. We're going to also give you an update on some of the legal and judicial cases that are impacting our industry. And then we're going to follow that with an outlook and a little bit of a forecast for the November elections and what that might mean for CDFIs. And then we'll round out with some advocacy tools and tips. And then we'll have lots of time for your questions at the end. So let's get started. I'm going to invite my colleague, Mary Scott Bayless, SVP of Public Policy, to join on screen. And she's going to walk us through the first part of the presentation.
Great, thank you, Defina. I'm going to start us off with our policy update, touching on appropriations and some work that the various federal agencies and Biden-Harris administration have done over the past several months. But I do want to start off, like we always do on these webinars, with a reminder of what our policy priorities are for the year. These are kind of our guiding principles as we're engaging with the federal government and policymakers around DC. And working on behalf of all of you in our membership. So I'm not going to read through all of them because I'm sure you all have seen these before and you are aware of it, but we are very focused on increasing resources for CDFIs across the federal government, both in grant programs and in lending programs. Climate finance is obviously a very popular topic. We are not talking about GGRF today, but I'm sure that there will be many opportunities in the coming months to learn more about that as award agreements get finalized. But we are also, I think, particularly relevant to this webinar is the third item down, mobilizing our network and partners to influence the policy environment. So that's really why today we are trying to spend a good portion of the webinar in providing you all tools and resources and examples about how you can be policy advocates, because we are here in DC every day. Our whole team is very involved, but there's nothing more valuable than policymakers and elected officials hearing about the direct impact that federal programs or regulations have in communities across the country. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the congressional outlook is similar to what we have seen over the past couple of months and years. So it is a divided government where we have, a House controlled by the Republican Party, the Senate controlled by the Democratic Party. In both those chambers, the margins are incredibly small, to the point where a handful of members, or in some cases, one or two members voting in opposition to what their party leadership would like to do can change the whole course of a piece of legislation. So it does mean that it's divided government and that there's little that is getting done and it's more difficult to actually govern. But it is one of the reasons that advocacy is even more important, because I think there's a lot of, thought that sometimes, why would talking to my one member of Congress make a big change to the whole, funding level for the CDFI funds or to this regulation or this program at Small Business Administration. And we are in an environment where it really is a couple of people can make a huge difference. But it is a little difficult to get things done in that environment. Another piece that is making it more difficult to get accomplishments over the finish line is their schedule this year. As we're all very well aware, and my colleague Sophia is going to talk about in a little bit, we have an election in just a couple of months in November, and every member of the House and a good portion of the Senate are up for re-election in addition to the presidency. So in the very small calendar that you can see in the corner, you'll note that there's 2 months on there that are essentially all white. There's no other color in them. And that indicates that both the House and the Senate are going to be back home, not in Washington, D.C. These will be excellent opportunities for all of you to try and plan a site visit, which is what we're going to have a deep dive into later on. But it means there's no opportunity in Washington for committee hearings, votes on the floor, or legislation to move forward. And those will be the months of August, which is the traditional recess month every year for Congress, and October, which is something that is a nod to the campaign schedule. Next slide, please. All right, so I want to give a brief update on appropriations because we have had some movement since our last webinar. As a little bit of a recap, in the president's budget request that came out earlier this spring, he recommended $325 million for the CDFI fund, which would be a $1 million increase over the current fiscal year. That was a bit disappointing for us. OFN is advocating for $350 million for the CDFI fund this year. We really feel that the demand in the industry and the current capital environment necessitate an increase in funding. We are well aware of the spending environment in DC, so it's unlikely that we could get as much as we actually need at the CDFI fund, and $350 million was what we felt was a reasonable ask based on the environment and the need. That the president's budget also included another priority of OFN for the second year in a row, which would be a $10 million credit subsidy for the bond guarantee program. The bond guarantee program has traditionally not had any federal credit subsidy and has been a 100% guarantee program. But as I'm sure some of you are well aware, this makes the program pretty difficult to use, and the underwriting standards from Treasury are very strict, and they involve a lot of over-collateralization. So we believe this credit subsidy could provide the Treasury Department some more flexibility and allow the program to be a bit more accessible for more CDFIs. This is something that was proposed last year and an idea that OFN has supported for several years. Last year it was included in the Senate bill, but did not ultimately become law. So we're still pushing away on that to see where it ends up this year. The House has really begun their appropriations process and has moved pretty quickly through their subcommittee and committee process and are now bringing bills to the floor. The House has marked up all of their bills to a significantly lower total dollar amount than what was originally agreed on. A couple years ago, there was an agreement between the House, the Senate, and the administration around the debt ceiling that was the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and that set guidelines for the level of spending for the next several years, and included small increases to non-defense domestic spending. Since that time, there's been changes in the leadership on the House side with the fall of Kevin McCarthy's speakership and ultimately Speaker Johnson coming into power. And his position both last year and this year has been that he was not party to that agreement, so he does not need to abide by it. And the numbers that the House Appropriations Committee is working with are significantly lower. As a result, their proposed appropriation level for the CDFI fund was $276.6 million, which is a huge cut to the program. This is similar to what they did last year, and I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. But the bill also originally didn't include any authorization for the bond guarantee program. There's always a $500 million guarantee authority in the appropriations bill. That's been consistent for several years now, but it turned out that was just a drafting error, so they did amend that and fix that during the full committee markup. So we were happy to see some progress. During that full committee markup, there were also several members that did speak up about their concerns around the funding level for the CDFI fund. So that was heartening to hear. But the bill did pass the full appropriations committee and is now awaiting going to the floor. It is scheduled to go to the floor the week of the 22nd. Next week is the Republican National Convention, so the House will not be in town, but it's going to come to the floor that week. So we will see what happens once it moves to the floor. One good piece of news, I'm sure a lot of you are aware, last year there was an amendment filed to zero out the CDFI fund when the same bill came to the floor. The amendment deadline for the bill was earlier this week, and we did not see any amendments filed to defund the CDFI fund. So there's always a chance someone could try and file something late or do something last minute, but I think it's a significant win for us that we at least were able to neutralize that threat of having a vote on the floor to completely zero out the CDFI fund. On the Senate side, they traditionally and are still moving a bit slower on their appropriations process, but we did want to highlight that there was a bipartisan Dear Colleague letter, so a letter that members of Congress sign on to and send to the Appropriations Committee that was supportive of $325 million for the CDFI fund, which was, again, a lower number than what we were hoping for, but still a bit of an increase and significantly better than the House number. So we are now working very closely with Senate offices and Senate staff to try and advocate for the highest possible appropriation on the Senate side. So when they ultimately come to negotiate the final amount, it ends up in a much better place. Next slide, please. So like I said, so last year the House proposed something similar to this funding level, and where the final bill ended up was $46 million higher than the initial House number. So we are hopeful that something similar comes out this year. We have strong bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. I think when we have had meetings, even on the House side and with Republicans that voted for this bill within committee, they still do express support for the CDFI fund and for the work you all are doing, and have just made comments about the extremely tight spending environment and the overall caps that each of the committees were given. So we are continuing to push, and this is one of the reasons that we need help from all of you all to get that message across. So you can go to the next slide, and I want to talk a little bit about who the people are who are making these funding decisions, and how your advocacy can help and how you can figure out who you should be talking to when you're in DC. So one thing that I wanted to mention on the House Appropriations leadership, something that doesn't typically happen in a non-election year happened this year. Usually it's just at the start of a new Congress that you get new chairs of committees and subcommittees. But on the House Appropriations side, Kay Granger, who was the chairwoman of the Full Appropriations Committee, had already announced she was retiring from Congress, not running for re-election this fall. And after they passed the current FY24 fiscal year bill, she announced that she was stepping down from the appropriations leadership position effective, as soon as they were able to name a replacement. So she remains in Congress, but has stepped down from leadership of appropriations. And Representative Tom Cole, Republican from Oklahoma, has now moved into that appropriations full committee chairmanship. And as a result of all of that, all the subcommittee chairs then moved around because openings, positions opened up on new subcommittees with Tom Cole's ascension into the chairmanship. So we ended up with a new chairman of the Financial Services and General Government Subcommittee as well. So at this time last year, it was Representative Womack from Arkansas that was chairing the FSGG subcommittee, and now David Joyce from Ohio took the reins earlier this year. So we are dealing with some new people. And then you go to the next slide, please. All right, so this is the full Financial Services and General Government Subcommittee in the House. You can see Steve Womack is still on the committee, even though he's no longer the chairman. But I wanted to talk a little bit about why these people are important and how you can, figure out who you need to be talking to when you're looking to do advocacy. So this is something that is applicable at the federal level, at the state level, really anytime you're working with a government body and trying to figure out how you can influence decision making and make sure that you're talking to the right people to have an impact about a program. First of all, what we always talk about is inviting and talking to your direct representatives. So based on where your organization is headquartered, who represents your area. And on our Take Action page on the website and in many other places, if you're not aware of who that member of Congress is, you can look it up by address or zip code. But I know many CDFIs, and not most CDFIs, lend in more than one congressional district. Your lending is not limited to, especially in urban areas. In one city, there could be 3 or 4 different congressional districts, or if you're in New York or LA, significantly more than that. So it's important to take a look at where you're lending overall, and then if that overlaps with any of the people who are in leadership positions. So in the case of the federal government or a state legislative body, we would recommend taking a look at what are the committees that are going to hear bills that are relevant to you. So appropriations or budget or something like that, depending on what level of government is typically going to be dealing with funding levels. You could also look at, on the federal level, you have on the House side, the Financial Services Committee, the Small Business Committee, Ways and Means, et cetera, that are representing several policy areas that impact CDFIs. So taking a look at the members of those committees, particularly the chair and ranking member of the committees, is important to see if there's overlap. And if you happen to lend in, Ohio 14, then you are could have an opportunity to influence the chair of the committee that ultimately sets the funding number for the CDFI fund. And that's not just important for the initial bill, like that the House has already put out their bill and it's already passed through the full committee. The chair and the ranking member of both the subcommittee and full committee will remain involved in the negotiation process kind of until an agreement is ultimately reached. So it's never a bad idea to reach out to those members of Congress. If you need help figuring out how your congressional districts overlap with people on certain committees, we are happy to help. And we have a slide later on about a tool and a new form that we're going to be rolling out in the next couple of months that will make it a little easier for us to help all of you do that and us to bring your influence to DC and make sure that your policymakers are aware of the good work and impact you're having there. Next slide, please. All right, so over on the Senate side, like I said, they have not rolled out their bill yet. Their subcommittee, the FSGG subcommittee, has remained the same currently for this Congress. So we have pretty strong relationships with most of the members of the committee on the Senate side. Several of them sit on the Bipartisan Community Development Finance Caucus. But we did want to just give an idea of who those people are, and you can look at if you have any loan or any work that touches any of these states. We strongly encourage you to reach out to those members of Congress as soon as possible. All right, next slide, please. And we're going to shift away from Congress a little bit and talk about some of the work that the federal agencies are doing. So I'm going to cover some housing announcements and then turn it over for a brief touch on certification before we move into the legal environment. So the Biden-Harris administration, so they're very focused on the implementation of programs and priorities for their administration. This is to obviously support their reelection. They want to be able to show that things have happened, that they've followed through on original campaign promises, that the things that they've worked on are having an impact for people across the country. So not just pushing the programs forward, but trying to bring attention to projects that have been done under the bipartisan infrastructure law or the Inflation Reduction Act or other big landmark pieces of legislation to make sure people are aware of that. There's also a strong focus on rulemaking, comment periods, getting things ensconced into federal regulation. And this is a bit of a defensive mechanism against a potential change in administration. So trying to make sure that work in progress that they've made and their priorities and ideas cannot just be immediately flipped if a new administration happens to win the election in November. I will let Defina talk about this in a little bit, but there have also been some significant court rulings, and there continues to be and will continue to be even more use of the judicial system to try and guide federal regulations and the actions of agencies and potentially limit the ability of agencies or the executive branch as a whole from being able to move forward priorities without express congressional intent for them to do so. Could go to the next slide, please. All right, so the administration, one of their big priorities has been housing. And recently, just about 2 weeks ago now, Secretary Yellen announced a couple of different new housing initiatives. We are in the process of publishing a blog post that goes into a little more detail on all of them, but I wanted to highlight 3 here on this slide that I think are most relevant to OFN and to our members. So the first one, she announced a new Treasury program administered by the CDFI fund focused on affordable housing. That program will be funded with $100 million over 3 years. And the funding from that is not congressionally appropriated. They're using proceeds from the ESIP program. So that's money that they had on hand and did not have to go through Congress for authorization. She made it very clear in her announcement that they have not designed this program yet. So this is a huge opportunity to try and influence and ensure that this program is set up in a way that can have the greatest impact and be easy to use and not burdensome for CDFIs or others working on affordable housing. So I think that's something that we are going to hear a lot more on in the next couple of months. We are engaging with Treasury to try and learn more about what their thoughts and priorities are on this program and see how we can help make suggestions for what would work. As we learn more, we will be sure to communicate what we can out with the membership. And as we have questions about the design of the program, make sure that we're consulting all of you as well. Second, she made an announcement that the administration is issued essentially a call to action or a challenge to the federal home loan bank system to increase their spending on affordable housing programs. So statutorily, they are required to spend 10% of their net proceeds on affordable housing programs. Most of the banks have voluntarily increased that to 15%. Secretary Yellen and the Biden-Harris administration were calling on them to increase that all the way up to 20%. This is just a call to action. To change it officially would require congressional action. So the administration cannot do that on their own. But it was a strong acknowledgement that the federal home loan bank system, the administration thinks they should be doing more to address this problem. And I'll talk a little bit more about some more FHLB changes on the next slide. But the third piece that is directly relevant to CDFIs, they announced an update to the Capital Magnet Fund program aimed at providing greater flexibility to CDFIs and nonprofit affordable housing developers. So last year, Treasury had put out a request for comment on the Capital Magnet Fund program. OFN responded, many of our members did, the Capital Magnet Fund Coalition and others. And that was building on previous advocacy and suggestions for changes to the program. And the administration has now issued what they're calling an interim final rule. So it's interim because it's still open for comments, but essentially it will be a new rule to operate under. We are still going through all of the details in that, and we'll have more information about the specific kind of wins that are in that new proposed rule in the coming days. And if we could go to the next slide. Thank you. So the CDFI fund, as I mentioned, it's an interim final rule. They're accepting comments on this new rule until August 26th. So we have a bit of time to respond to that. It is unlikely that these comments are going to significantly change the content of the rule. It's a kind of requirement that they accept these comments, but really they're looking to see if there's anything that they missed, anything that's confusing, any definitions that may be unclear, etc. But it's unlikely that they're going to make big policy changes in this comment period. But it's still important that we weigh in and let them know where they did well, where they may have missed the mark, or other areas for improvement, so that as future changes are made, we're on record and that they're aware of those issues. And there may be some issues that they give themselves enough flexibility that they can make changes to them in individual assistance agreements or things like that, rather than having to change the entire rule itself. I also mentioned that there are some other things around the federal home loan bank system. So there's two separate comment periods that are open right now through the Federal Housing Finance Agency that relate to federal home loan banks. So one is around what should the federal home loan bank system's core mission be and what activities should look like under that. And then the other one is around ways to improve their affordable housing program and that funding process and application process. So both of these are related both to Secretary Yellen's announcement encouraging the banks to dedicate more funding to affordable housing, and a process that FHFA went through most last year, might have started in 2022 actually, but to review the federal home loan bank system called Federal Home Loan Bank at 100. The banks are approaching their 100th anniversary. So FHFA held roundtables around the country. I know several of our members participated, OFN participated, and then also accepted comments on what they could be doing, what the Federal Home Loan Bank should be doing to improve at 100 years old. And our comments mostly focused on working closer with CDFIs and improving that relationship and understanding the CDFI model and identifying roadblocks at either the whole system or individual bank levels that made it hard for CDFIs to access the federal home loan banks. They then issued a report. FHFA issued a report, and we were very pleased to see that they did highlight that the whole bank system needed to work closer with CDFIs, kind of acknowledging many of the concerns that we had raised. And this call from the administration and now these comment periods are starting to be their actions to try and implement some of the recommendations that they had in that report. So this is part of the, trying to get things into regulation from the administration's priorities, but it is also a win for the advocacy that we and many of our members have been leading on to help get more access to this resource for CDFIs and our members. And then I am going to turn it over to Defina next to talk about certification. So next slide, please.
Great. Thank you, Mary Scott, for those excellent updates. And I'm just going to briefly touch on everyone's favorite topic, CDFI certification. So we, along with everyone in the industry, have been very focused on the recertification process that is taking place, where all certified CDFIs are going to have to reapply under the new application rules and standards. And so as many of you know, there have been quite a few bumps in the road in that process over the past several months as they rolled out the new application late last year. And we're getting to a concerning level where there were kind of issues in both the application technology, but also lots of questions that were, sort of open questions that were preventing CDFIs from really being able to move forward with getting themselves ready to reapply. So we had been communicating a lot of that to the CDFI fund, along with many of the other CDFI trade associations and many of you through your AMIS service requests and through other means. And we're really pleased to see that late last month, the CDFI fund actually decided to kind of delay some of the timelines for when CDFIs have to reapply and release some of the pressure both on the industry and themselves to really do all of this by December 20th of this year, which was the original timeline. And so what they did was they kind of delayed and extended the early application timeline that was put in place that was supposed to be open last month, but now there's going to be a little bit more time for those 300 or so CDFIs that are applying early. And I think that's going to be a great opportunity for the fund to really kind of see how it goes, to really understand what some of the core questions and issues are, to smooth out any issues on the technology side. And then everyone else in that general round got a little bit more time as well to reapply. So you can see in the chart that's on the screen that depending on when your fiscal year ends, there'll be a 2-month window by which you have to apply. And so essentially, we got about an extra year for the CDFI industry to reapply under recertification. So that certainly was good news. Next slide. But we know that there's still lots of questions and issues and challenges that we are continuing to work through to make sure that all CDFIs that are doing great work and that really rely on that certification for lots of different reasons are able to reapply successfully. And so we are going to continue to work with our members and our network to kind of identify what those challenges and those issues are and be able to kind of aggregate them and deliver those to the CDFI funds in the hopes that they can address a lot of those concerns, that they can put out updated FAQs and guidance and documents based on any areas or concerns that are bubbling up from across the industry. So we are still hosting our CDFI certification office hours. Thank you to all of you who have participated. We are taking all of your feedback and questions and comments and again, aggregating those, getting those over to the fund. Our next office hours will be on Monday, July 15th. And those are going to be at 2 p.m. And if you have questions, we also have a dedicated email address where you can send your issues or your questions directly there. So certification@ofn.org. Just making sure that we have lots of avenues and opportunities for all of you to help us understand what the challenges are so that we can then work with the fund to try to get some of that stuff resolved. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about something that probably wasn't on our bingo card for some of the policy lens and work that we were going to have to be doing maybe a year or so ago. But there has been a lot of activity in the court system and a lot of actual kind of changes and updates since our last webinar in April, where we had a couple of guest speakers that sort of gave us an overview of the landscape and even some new cases that have been filed since then. So as I think we're all aware, the pushback to DEI and race-conscious programming has reached the CDFI industry and is an ongoing concern in the policy environment. Some of these cases are related to federal programs, and others like Fearless Fund and Lift Fund are directly related to the work of CDFIs, or the idea that channeling resources to certain groups based on race or other protected class characteristics is really coming under fire. So these legal challenges have real implications for our work and broader efforts to advance racial equity and social justice. So we started to see some of this litigation popping up a few years ago during the pandemic, where some of the pandemic relief programs that were designed to provide some preferences for racial and ethnic minorities were challenged in court. The SBA's Restaurant Realization Fund and the USDA's Black Farmer Loan Program are a couple of really good examples of that. However, after the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action last year, these lawsuits really started to accelerate. So I'm just going to go through some of these current cases and again, give updates on ones where we've seen some movement in the past couple of months. So on Fearless Fund, the Fearless Fund is a venture capital program, and they are providing essentially $10,000 to $20,000 grants to early stage Black women-owned businesses. They were sued by a group called the American Alliance for Equal Rights that basically saying that the grant program violated a section of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that protects the equal rights of all persons to make and enforce contracts without respect to race. And they asked for an injunction to stop the group from being able to provide any more of those grants while the case proceeded. So at first, the injunction was denied at the district court level because that judge said that basically that lawsuit was unlikely to be successful. However, in May, a federal court of appeals actually suspended the grant program. They ruled that the conservative group that brought the challenge is likely to prevail in the lawsuit that claims the program is discriminatory. This case is pretty likely to make it all the way to the Supreme Court. But that's where things stand right now, is that as of right now, that they are not able to kind of move forward with issuing more grants. In the Hello Alice case, a lawsuit was filed against the insurance company Progressive and the fintech platform Hello Alice. They had a grant program that was, essentially of helping Black-owned small businesses purchase commercial vehicles, and they also were sued by a conservative-backed nonprofit called America First Legal that essentially claimed that the grant program is unconstitutional because it limited participation of certain racial groups. So that case actually this spring was dismissed by a federal district judge in Ohio, and similar types of lawsuits have also been dismissed against Amazon, Pfizer, and Starbucks. In the case of Lyft Fund, an OFN member, of course, a group called the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty filed a lawsuit against Behar County and Lyft Fund, alleging that their $10 million program, their small business assistance program, discriminated against small business owners based on race. The suit alleged that a white male and his software company that applied for the program were denied because of a scoring methodology that gave preferences based on race and gender. And essentially that the plaintiff's application was put to the back of the line and ultimately denied. So in late May, Lyft Fund and Behar County were granted a motion to dismiss in this case, because the plaintiff was actually ineligible to apply for the grant program due to missing required documentation and had no standing to really bring the case. So that's a big win for Lyft Fund in that situation. But again, there's also a decent chance that that case will also be appealed. So probably haven't heard the last of that there. And then there's a newer lawsuit filed against Citibank in late May. This is actually a class action lawsuit that alleged that Citigroup has an express policy of charging customers different ATM fees based on race. So the plaintiffs allege that Citigroup waives out-of-network fees for people who bank at certain financial institutions. So for about 50-ish financial institutions that includes MDIs and CDFI credit unions, their customers can actually make cash withdrawals from Citi's ATMs without a surcharge at their network of more than 2,000 ATMs across the country. The complaint alleged that the bank adopted the policy for financial reasons in order to attract customers who are interested in supporting DEI. So that case obviously just filed. We don't really know how that one will end up, but you're seeing the trend here in some of these cases that are being brought against either programs or ways that we're engaging in activities that have any sort of lens that have racial preference on them. On the public sector side, the federal government has been facing even more lawsuits. So the Minority Business Development Agency, there was another case brought against them. Essentially, all of the cases that are coming up on the public sector side are challenging what's called the rebuttable presumption of disadvantage. And so for the case of MBDA, they were sued because saying that the assistance provided by MBDA is only available for minority businesses from people of certain racial or ethnic backgrounds, and that is racially discriminatory and violates the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause because they're only available to socially or economically disadvantaged individuals, and only certain groups are able to actually make that presumption of social disadvantage. So the courts agreed with that challenge and essentially said that the way that MBDA structures programs and its business outreach is unconstitutional. And so essentially that the MBDA was trying to remedy private discrimination cases and access to credit, and that wasn't really enough of a compelling interest for the government to act in that way. So in March of this year, there is a nationwide permanent injunction preventing MBDA, as well as anyone who administers its programs. So I know there are some CDFIs that have engaged in outreach centers or administer MBDA programs, are not allowed to consider using an applicant's race or ethnicity in determining eligibility for programming. Similarly, in the SBA's 8A program, um, very similar idea here, which is, the SBA and the USDA using race and the rebuttable presumption of social disadvantage violates some constitutional rights and allowing, certain members of certain racial and ethnic groups to essentially automatically be considered to be disadvantaged is unconstitutional. So the court once again sided with the plaintiffs who brought that case, and you know, both agencies essentially changed their processes to accommodate for these rulings. So in the case of the SBA, you will now have to complete what's called a social disadvantage narrative. It's pretty thorough and comprehensive. You have to list specific examples of how, when, where, and why you have been a victim of racial discrimination, and submit that to the agency, and they will, determine whether that is sufficient. In the case of MBDA, it's not quite as onerous. You have to fill out essentially like an attestation or a form that you're, socially disadvantaged. But important note here for CDFIs is that the MBDA's guidance noted that the business centers also have to ensure that their operations, communications, promotional materials, websites, intake processes all have to make it very, very clear that individuals of any race or ethnicity who qualify as socially or economically disadvantaged are eligible for those programs. So a couple of things to note here just about the general tenor of all of these cases. Many of these cases are being brought by the same group of conservative activists led by a man named Edward Blum. Is a well-funded, well-resourced group that's really looking to kind of a chilling effect on a lot of the efforts to advance racial equity that CDFIs are leading, but lots of other organizations are leading too. So not only are they looking to win these cases, but they're also hoping that organizations will really back off this work and out of fear and concern about facing litigation. So that's one piece. The other piece is the location matters, and so a lot of these cases, they're looking for opportunities to file them in more conservative district federal courts where they know they can get probably more favorable decisions. But in a lot of cases, they're also looking to really drag on these cases and these fights all the way to the Supreme Court, where there's an above average chance that the conservative majority there will rule in their favor. So that's kind of what's underlying a lot of this environment. So next slide, please. So what can you do? I think, always like to give the disclaimer that I'm not an attorney. We are not attorneys on the call. So we're just sort of reporting out information and facts. But as the trade association, we are always thinking about how we can best support our members and what CDFIs can do to navigate this new environment. So I think the most important thing that you can do is consult with an attorney. If you don't have one, consider trying to locate one that's working pro bono or working on civil rights in your communities. Consult your networks. I'm sure someone knows someone that has a connection that can help you get some legal advice to just look at your materials, your programs, your marketing, just to determine what level of risk or liability you might be facing and what, if any, changes or updates you might want to consider making. Again, this is entirely going to be up to your organization and your board and your individual risk tolerance, but I think it's a smart move to start consulting with an attorney on a lot of this. The next thing is that data and documentation really matter when it comes to these cases. So document as much as possible so that you're able to kind of point to the exact issues that you're trying to remedy with your programs. More data in support of this work is always helpful. The same idea with kind of working with our policymakers. Our policymakers actually have an important role to play here in helping to build the legislative record in support of this work. A lot of times courts will look for, what's the body of evidence supporting both sides of this case, and what's the information, on to help them make a decision. And they will look to the legislative record. They'll look at legislative findings, reports to Congress, congressional testimony, floor speeches, anything that can really help provide some additional evidence and data that might help them make a decision. Statistics are important. Sometimes they cite agency data, studies, academic research, all these things, hearings, expert testimony. So if you get called to testify, this is a great reminder to make sure that, your written and oral testimony is really kind of well researched and well cited, because again, a lot of this stuff is going to potentially be part of the record when either CDFIs are facing legal challenges or some of the programs that we're using are also facing challenges. So just important there. All right, next slide. So just keeping the bad news train rolling here on my end. I think we all had, sort of been paying close attention to what was happening with a lot of the Supreme Court decisions that came out in the last couple of weeks. And, we're really just entering in an era where what's happening in the courts is truly impacting how we engage in policy and what our work looks like. And I think the Chevron decision, as this kind of colloquially known, is a great example of something that is happening in the court system that will 100% impact how we do our policy work. So we were not surprised to see this decision in the Lober case, and while that ruling kind of came down wasn't surprising, it still is going to kind of upend the balance of power in the federal government. So what is this Chevron case, right? We have essentially been operating under what's called the Chevron deference doctrine, named after a 1984 case that directed courts to defer to an agency's interpretation when a law is ambiguous or unclear. On June 28th, the Supreme Court ruling basically overturned that 40-year legal precedent. And the ruling will make it much harder for federal agencies to defend regulations that end up in court. It also creates kind of a wide open opportunity for companies and individuals to challenge rules that might be unfavorable to their business or their bottom line. So in the absence of kind of the Chevron deference, the courts will now be the ones who are deciding and interpreting what Congress intended when either there's a difference of opinion or the statute is actually unclear. It's a pretty stunning diminishment of the power of the executive branch. And again, it will impact the CDFI industry. Everything from environmental regulations to healthcare to bank regulations are likely going to be impacted by this decision. Next slide. So again, it'll take some time, I think, before we fully understand what this actually means, but we have a pretty decent sense about what we might see in the future going forward. One is that, there's just probably going to be a lot more kind of legal action taken when there is a regulation put forth or a rule put forth that some organization or business doesn't like. They're going to have a pretty easier time kind of bringing action against that agency, and the courts will then have to take up trying to determine, well, what is it that Congress actually meant when they were writing the statute? And it really takes a little bit of the experts and the career staff at federal agencies who have like expertise in some of these areas to interpret these rules, kind of taking them out of it a little bit, not fully, they will still have a role, obviously, but shifting some of that to the courts who most likely don't have the same level of expertise as some of the folks working at federal agencies. Practically speaking, there's some pending lawsuits related to some big regulatory changes that OFN and the CDFI industry have been both advocating for and watching very closely that I think that this decision will impact. One is obviously the lawsuit against the new Community Reinvestment Act regulations that was brought by the Texas Bankers Association and a couple of other parties. Those regulations were already kind of being challenged on the idea that they exceeded the statutory authority provided to the bank regulators. And so you can kind of see exactly why that might fit into something that was impacted by Chevron, which is the courts will review and say, yeah, it does look like actually the OCC, the Fed, and the FDIC kind of overstepped outside of what the Community Reinvestment Act was supposed to be, or what the definition of credit needs, or what defines a community, or all these things potentially could be at play as these cases kind of wind through the courts. Section 1071 is another rule of small business lending data collection where there is an ongoing challenge and a similar argument being made here, which is, what was in the Dodd-Frank Act. The CFPB kind of took it a step further than perhaps what some people think was intended in the statute. And, I don't exactly know how, because these cases are pending currently, whether they'll have to sort of refile them, citing the changes in Chevron, or whether the courts will consider this decision. It's unclear, but you can kind of see how things that are ambiguous, unclear, when the federal agency is really trying to advance a policy position, how this case will impact their ability to kind of make broad policy changes within the executive branch. So more to come there, but we just thought it was really important to kind of highlight what actually might be coming our way. I think another thing we need to think about is this might have a little bit of a chilling effect too on what agencies are willing to do. So everything from the CDFI fund to USDA, EPA, the regulators, they're probably likely to take a more nuanced and kind of conservative stance on policymaking to try to avoid some of these legal challenges. And then it also puts a lot more pressure on Congress to write bills that are a lot more specific, a lot more detailed, a lot more defined. And so that means, again, we're going to have to be much more careful about how we propose legislation, how we review bill text, the things that we leave open for interpretation when we're trying to pass laws. We're already in a really kind of tight and divided legislative environment, so it's going to make it that much harder to actually come to an agreement on important policy areas when you're going to have to really agree on the fine details. So I say all that to say, very kind of interesting shifts in the dynamics between the three branches of government. And then, of course, we are closely watching the political situation because changes in agency leadership and flipping the balance of power in DC. Thinking about, again, maybe what an EPA under a Trump administration might look like and how that'll impact things like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Like, we're just entering a much more volatile political environment where our work is going to be challenged and stressed in new and different ways. So we're really focused on how we can prepare the industry and support all of you. And that involves analyzing the potential outcomes for this election and how that is going to impact our priorities. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sophia Gilkson, Senior Associate on the policy team, who's going to preview what we might see in the 2024 elections in November.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sophia Gilkson, like Defina said, Senior Associate on our Public Policy team. So here we are 4 years later in another election year. We know that the presidential election is a really important one and quite contested. This map here shows kind of where polling puts a lot of numbers currently. So there are 6 swing states. Obviously, in 2020, the balance leaned towards President Biden, current President Biden, but really unclear about this next election this year. This map kind of outlines states where, based on like the color, the shade of the color, kind of where we think votes will end up, but ultimately more to be seen, more to happen. Next slide. The good news is we have seen both of these presidential nominees in power before, so nothing too unexpected in either administration. So in the outlook for a second Biden administration, we do expect, at least on the agency and regulatory side of things to kind of continue business as usual. They'll continue to focus on this environmental justice work, which has been a huge part of his first administration. They'll continue to implement the agenda from the big legislative wins, like the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. which is where we got the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund from. We do expect that there would likely be some changes in political appointees. So looking at agencies that might affect CDFIs, we don't know if the SBA administrator would stay on for another 4 years, or say, the Treasury Secretary. It's likely there could be new leadership at those agencies. Ultimately, legislatively, there would probably be not a whole lot of room for big sweeping changes. Even if there were Democratic control of Congress, it would be pretty tight. As we've seen the last few years, there's been a lot of gridlock. We would expect if President Biden were to take the presidency, and even if there were a divided Congress, there'd be just more gridlock. Of course, we saw any exception to that trend to be any sort of major disaster. So we saw an unprecedented amount of collaboration and working together, basically, between both chambers in COVID-19. Our focus in a potential Biden administration would be to support regulatory action that doesn't require congressional approval. So that's the kind of agency side work that Mary Scott and Defina have already touched on. We would continue to want to deepen those relationships, say if new political appointees came into the key agencies we work with, continue to focus on building up CDFIs as the best delivery mechanism to ensure resources are reaching LMI people and places. So next slide. And again, in the case of a Trump administration, it would be the second one. So it wouldn't be too different from the first time around. You may have heard of Project 2025, which is this massive playbook that they've put forward for the case of a second Trump administration. He would continue to enact a lot of his party's priorities. Much of that has been to continue to reduce federal spending and federal government power in general. So we could expect more fiscal cuts, which would obviously be pretty challenging to our industry, given our appropriations are already spread pretty thin and haven't matched the growth of the industry. We would expect probably some more proposals to zero out the CDFI fund. We know that community economic development programs likely wouldn't be safe under a Trump administration. And there would just be more regulatory barriers for CDFIs to access key programs. So in the case of a second Trump administration, we would be focusing on those adverse regulatory policy changes, trying to maintain momentum that we've already built with career staff. We were able to maintain some pretty good relationships at the SBA, for example, during the Trump administration. We would continue to focus on educating administration officials about CDFIs. We know that we have a lot of bipartisan support, luckily, so probably focusing on lifting up more of those areas where the administration would be focused on, so rural and other policy areas of alignment. And then, of course, there would be more opportunity likely at more local levels when it comes to resources. So maybe focusing less on the federal aspect and more on the state and local policy work, which we know a lot of you are already quite active in. So next slide. Great. And along with the presidential election, we of course have our congressional elections. So to start with Senate, there are 34 states where there are Senate seats being contested. Similarly, this map kind of breaks down the likelihood of which party those states would swing towards based on the color. 3 states are pretty much a toss-up, quite unclear. But it's not looking great for the Democratic Party, since 23 of these 34 seats that would be up for election are being defended by Democrats. So the Republicans do have a little bit of a favored position here. Next slide. And of course, every 2 years, we reelect every district, or each district in the House is up for election, since those terms are only 2 years. Right now, the Republicans have a super narrow majority, and it really could go either way. What is needed for a majority in the House is 218 seats for either party. So more to be seen. Make sure you register to vote and participate in primaries where possible. But yeah, next slide. So to talk a little bit more about what either of these potential outlooks could look like. So if we were to have a divided government, so, you know, one party controlling either house, we would expect, which is the state we're currently in, we would expect continued gridlock and not a whole lot of legislative accomplishments. We've seen Congress be historically ineffective in legislating, so we would expect more of that trend to follow if there were a divided government. If we were to see a full Democratic control of both the House and Senate, we know that their party is pretty supportive for equity issues, which often touch CDFI's work. But we would see Republicans turning more to the judicial, the court side of things to ensure their policy priorities are not being ignored. If there were to be a full Republican control of both House and Senate, we would expect, similarly, as I discussed with the Trump administration policy priorities, a lot of cutbacks in funding. However, even given the control that they currently have over the House, things aren't always clear cut. We obviously saw a historic vote and revote for House Speaker. So there are a lot of factions within the party that can't quite come to an agreement on even what they want to do along party lines. Ultimately, it's a new Congress in the 119th, which means there's potential for a lot of new members of Congress. And our goal, our focus as OFN and Voice of the Industry is going to be to introduce ourselves to any new members of Congress, really trying to get as far reach as possible. There's also a lot of staff turnover after every election on the Hill. So we would do our best to cultivate those relationships at the staff levels too. And when we get more into advocacy, we'll discuss, well, actually, we can just go to the next slide. It's a good segue to our advocacy discussion. So this all presents a really awesome opportunity for each of you to be local advocates and advocates with your members of Congress. So next slide. Ultimately, you are experts and you are the voices of your CDFIs, of the industry, and of your communities. So it's really helpful for elected officials to hear from you directly in DC what the work is in their local communities. Your voice and involvement are invaluable in securing these policy priorities that benefit CDFIs and the communities at large that we are all serving. We really encourage each of you to be advocates. Really, it doesn't matter what kind of work you do, whether it's comms or investment, loan officers, everything. You guys have the on-the-ground expertise. You're the ones enacting each of these programs at all levels of government. So it's important for your elected officials to know the impact. We know that data goes, of course, a long way, and we're happy to support with any sort of data that we can. But stories mean a lot, and they make a really powerful impact on each of the elected officials and their staff. They can really leave a lasting impact. We see it all the time whenever we're meeting with staff. They know about the story of, say, Mountain BizWorks, you know, funding a solar project. There's all sorts of projects that staff recall when we share these stories and when they hear directly from you. And that goes on to inform the importance for, say, funding decisions. Like I said, we're here to support your advocacy, and there are a lot of ways to advocate at every level of time commitment. The ones that are maybe have a lower barrier to entry, we have a policy action tool that we'll share in our resources later on, but that can take less than 5 minutes, just submitting a letter to your member of Congress telling them about your CDFI and why the appropriations number matters. So next slide. So yeah, just to talk a little bit more about how you can hone your message. Ultimately, it can be really intimidating to go into these meetings, but we find when you have these we offer these 3 tips to you to make sure that your message lands. So it's important when you go into any meeting with a policymaker to provide them the context, describe the issue and why it's important to your work. So you're basically presenting a problem and a solution. We recommend that you stay focused on your main priorities. You don't want to meander too much. Just make sure that your asks are focusing on these issues and align with the priorities that your CDFI is facing. And of course, when you can, also uplifting the industry as a whole. And lastly, we recommend that whatever you're asking for is actionable. Oftentimes these meetings will be quite quick. You might not have a whole lot of time to go into the whole history of whatever issue it is you're talking about. And at the end of the day, a lot of these staffers need an action item that they can take to their bosses. So we recommend that your ask kind of anchors all of this, and it should be quite direct. And for instance, every year we go in and we have our appropriations ask, 350 million, and then we use the context and the priorities to back up that main ask. If you need help identifying an ask, our policy team is here to help you. We have our policy priorities document that lays out quite a few of these very specific asks. And then of course, having you as an expert to describe the context and the impact it would make to support this ask is super important as well in making the persuasive point about what your policy asks are. So with that, I am going to pass it on to my colleague Lily Jin to go a little bit more in depth into one of the many exciting ways you can be an advocate.
Hi, thanks, Sophia. For those who I haven't met yet, I'm Lily Jin, and I joined OFN's policy team as an associate in May. And I'll be speaking on a particularly effective advocacy tool, which is hosting a site visit. This is basically just when you invite a government official, such as your representative, a senator, maybe someone in the administration, to visit a small business that you lend to or any of your other project sites. You can see the picture on the left is of the Deputy Secretary of USDA, and she's with OFN in Kentucky visiting one of our members' borrowers, Hazard Coffee Company. And this captures the reason why site visits are so effective, because they get to see your work in action and also meet people firsthand who can describe the impact of your work. The other benefits of hosting a site visit is that it helps build your relationships with members of Congress and other government officials. It generates good publicity for your organization, which can also raise the profile of the industry as a whole. And you can also showcase unique projects to show the innovation and the value of your work. And it's also a good way to get involved in advocacy without having to travel to DC. And we want to help you with this as much as possible and make it kind of a turnkey activity for you. Next slide, please. So next I'll talk a little about how you can select a borrower or site that's would be the most appropriate for the visit. You want to host the visit with a borrower who not only underscores the success of your organization, but also someone who will attract the interest of your legislator. So these are a few things to consider that speak to both of those points. You want to consider your legislator's interests. So if the representative that you're inviting particularly cares about childcare and you help fund a childcare center, that would be a good site to visit. You also want to consider a borrower who can explain your impact. So if there's someone you lend to who you think would be a good candidate to articulate how you've helped them, that would be someone who would be good to visit. And also more on the logistics side, you'd want to consider a location that makes sense, and also the impact of other possible events that they might be going to that day. Next slide, please. We're going to pivot to some of the more logistical parts of planning a site visit. In terms of timing, your best chance at hosting a site visit is when your congressman is working back home in their district or state. And we can help you determine when that is. And you can also visit the House and Senate homepages to see the congressional schedules and when they're having their recesses. If you're hosting your representative or a senator, they typically have a pretty packed schedule. So you could probably assume that, you'll only get them for about an hour. But you should definitely coordinate with their scheduler about timing and availability. On the other hand, if you have their staff coming instead, you might have longer with them and could tour multiple sites in a day. Next slide, please. So something else you want to plan for is how you want the site visit to go. And you can do that by scripting the site visit and helping prep whoever is going to be speaking that day to the visitor. So this includes doing a bit of research to put together some background materials on the guest so you know what interests them and how you can speak to that. You'll also want to create an agenda or a run of show so your staff and your borrowers know what they should be speaking about and when that would be appropriate to speak about. And you should also help your borrowers with crafting some talking points so they feel prepared to speak to your guest and can hit on any important points that you want to emphasize about your work. And you also want to make contingency plans just in case things are running behind or don't go as planned, which happens more often than not. Next slide, please. So in the previous slide, I mentioned drafting some talking points, and this just really helps whoever is speaking that day drive home the value of your work and the importance of your guest support of it. So your talking points should really reflect how the site visit showcases your impact locally. A few things to consider when you're writing your talking points are the guest's interests. So if they really care about job creation, make sure to hit on how many jobs the site supports and how important that is for the community. You want to tell a story. So this just pulls at the heartstrings and can be more engaging than just rattling off facts or statistics, which are also important. So, for example, if you think about the Barber of Little Rock documentary that was about one of our members, it got a lot of attention because it really told the story of Arlo and his CDFI, and that resonated with a lot of people. And you also want to connect the dots of how your legislators' support directly contributes to your local impact. So this can be how certain policies or investments that they voted for or supported have directly enabled you to make an impact. Next slide, please. And the last thing is after the site visit wraps up, you want to make sure that you continue to keep in touch with whoever took the time to visit your site. This is just the start in building that strong relationship. So, for example, if it's a member of the appropriations committee, they'll think of you and all the fantastic work that you do in the industry as a whole when determining appropriations. So one way you can do that is to coordinate with the policymaker staff to share any photos of the day and also to get approval on what you're posting on social media and what they might post on social media. You can also write a thank you email to not only the legislator and their staff for taking the time to visit and their support of the industry, but also to your borrower for participating that day as well. So now I'll hand it over to YA to talk about our resources and some of the other ways you can get involved with advocacy.
Thank you, Lily, and thank you to the rest of my colleagues for speaking before me. So like Mary Scott said in the beginning, there's nothing more important than making sure that our representatives are hearing our concerns and speaking out about issues that we see that are arising. So other ways that you can get involved is by visiting OFN's Policy Action Center. If you look that up, it'll come right up. And on there, you're able to share your stories and data, find out who your representatives are in the area, and then stay informed about policies. There are tons of advocacy tools, and the page offers a bunch of resources. And so it's important that you guys are all going on there and just staying up to date on like what we're working on. Next slide, please. And then with that, we are launching a form on CDFI Connect to collect your CDFI like data. And as an intern myself, I have been doing a lot of work with this and reading about the stories. And so it's important for other people to know what's happening and the work that you're doing to contribute. And so on that form, we're just trying to collect your state and congressional district served, lending specialties, impact stories, existing government relations. And that way it helps us help you and the people that we are trying to help. It's also important to know that this information is crucial as it helps the policy team identify when your voice matters most when we're talking to policymakers as we are in DC. And so when we are doing our fly-ins and meeting with constituents on the Hill, that is when that data will become important for us so that we're able to share it and have facts to back it up. And so with that, we want you to watch out for an email from one of our team members, and you can also keep an eye out on the members only page of CDFI Connect in order to find out more about this when the form goes out. And next I'll pass it to Mary Scott, who will then wrap it all up and we'll take questions later.
Great, thank you. So the last two slides, and we will share these out as we said at the beginning, are just links to a lot of different resources and places where you can find out more, particularly beyond the Take Action page that YA just talked about, which is linked here. The OFN blog, we write a lot of articles on policy developments in the public policy communications page, which is where we post a lot of the comment letters and other things that we write in response to both federal agencies and Congress. And then the last slide, please. The last slide just has all of our contact information. We are always happy to answer questions directly. Speaking of that, I think we have a couple of questions in the Q&A box. I can see the little red indicator that there's at least something in there. But if you have other questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. The whole team is going to come back on screen now, and we will take your questions, but we are also always available by email or however else you want to reach out, and happy to help you in your policy development and your policy advocacy. And we are well aware that a lot of the things that we covered in today's presentation are a little bit scary or a little bit depressing. But one thing I really want to hammer home is that your individual advocacy and your organization's advocacy does matter. In both the House and the Senate, those maps that Sophia went over, we're talking, 5 seats, 4 seats, something like that may be the balance of power. So that has a huge impact. And we already have strong bipartisan support. So the more that we can grow that, the better we can advocate for all of you. Let me open up any Q&A. I think we've answered a lot of them in writing as we were going along. But I did want to mention, I think there was an ask for where to access the comment periods, the links to respond to the FHFA comments on both the Federal Home Loan Bank issues, So we will also be updating the Action Center to link out to those comment opportunities. So that'll be a resource anyone can use. FHFA also just very helpfully lists them all in one page on their website called Public Input. Most agencies don't do that. So I think that is a big one. I think I saw some more questions. Okay, we had another question about having a list of contacts or scheduler contacts for senators and representatives. We don't publish a list, but we are happy to provide you with specific contact information for your representatives or senators. So if you reach out to any of us, the email addresses that were up before, or just public.policy@ofn.org, that's an address that'll go to all of us. We can help connect you with both the schedulers for those representatives, the staff that cover certain issue areas if there's something you're interested in, or even contacts for the district staff if you're looking to plan something in district. Okay. What are the chances that an actual budget bill passes versus just a CR? Before September 30th, I think 0. So the fiscal year will begin on October 1st. Even in years where Congress is getting stuff done, they don't tend to get their appropriations bills done on time. And this is not one of those years. I think the latest I've seen is that they would be aiming for December or later to pass a final budget bill. I do think they will eventually pass something. They almost always do. Like there is a chance of a full year CR, but I think there's a strong chance that it will be post, not just post elections, but post a new administration and members of Congress being sworn in next January. But I will see if anyone else in the policy team wants to make predictions.
I do not, but I'm happy to answer the Biden administration question because I think it's a great one. So the question is, with the recent calls for Biden to step aside, how would an alternate Democratic administration impact priorities? I think the short answer is it depends on who that nominee is, but if it is Vice President Kamala Harris, we are in an excellent position because she has been one of our strongest champions in the Biden administration. She absolutely loves CDFIs and has been a really big proponent of our involvement in everything from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to helping even navigate some of the challenges around CDFI certification. And so I think we would have a very strong champion and ally if she were to be the one to step into that role. And in general, I think we tend to have pretty decent alignment with lots of the other kind of policy priorities of Democratic administrations. But I also just want to note that, as Mary Scott's mentioned several times, our work is bipartisan, and we will engage with, advocate, and lobby whoever wins the election, no matter who the nominee is and who their vice president is. Our work does not stop. It's just maybe some of the messaging and the tactics and the tools might be a little bit different, but whether it's a Trump administration or a Harris administration or Biden administration, CDFIs still need to keep the pressure on the federal government to ensure that we're both getting new resources, but also protecting all of the work and the gains that we've made over the past, several decades at this point.
And I think the next question is kind of directly related to that, about who CDFI's strongest Republican advocates are in the House and Senate. So the answer in the Senate is a little more direct and easy. There's literally a website that we can put the link in for that has a list. So in the Senate, they have a bipartisan community development finance caucus. So I believe we're up to 26 members now, so over a quarter of the Senate, and it is evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. So Senator Crapo from Idaho is the Republican that co-chairs that with Senator Warner, the Democrat from Virginia. So we recognized both of them this past fall at our CDFI Champions Award ceremony during the conference. But equally so, the other 12 members on the Republican side have been advocates for CDFIs and have taken a step to join this caucus and express their support. That caucus is a particularly active one. There are a lot that are basically in name only. you know, caucuses where they all just kind of sign up, but they never do anything. The CDFI caucus meets very regularly. They engage with OFN, with our members, with other allies to put on briefings and other events. In the House, there's not quite a neat list. There's not a caucus, at least not yet. But I think we have strong support across various committees. I know I mentioned earlier that we were happy this year that there wasn't an amendment to defund to the CDFI fund. I think one thing I forgot to point out, although that was an amendment filed by a Republican, when they got to the debate on it, the person who stood up to debate against the amendment was also a Republican. So it was Representative Womack from Arkansas. So I think, you know, it's not, you know, coming for one particular party or the other. We really do have very strong support. Not sure if anyone else wants to mention any particular champions. I always feel bad calling out individual names because I know I would forget someone.
You know, I feel like the entire Arkansas congressional delegation, they're actually pretty strong on CDFIs, and I think that's a testament to a couple of things. One is just like the amazing work of the CDFIs that are headquartered in Arkansas and throughout the Delta, but also the really significant economic need for the investment of CDFI resources. You really see in states where, you know, you've got a lots of, you know, persistent poverty and things like that, that we tend to actually enjoy really robust bipartisan support because people understand the value of the work that CDFIs do and you know, want to be supportive of that. So I just wanted to give a shout out to the Arkansas congressional delegation.
All right, and we have one more question. So I will also, as we're answering this one, put out a last call for questions. And if anyone else wants to put anything in there, but it was about the bond guarantee program and specifically the $10 million subsidy. As I mentioned, it was not included in the House bill. It was included in the Senate bill last year, so there's some thought there. But the question was whether we think there's openness on the House side to including that. I will also invite Sophia to weigh in on this if she wants to. I think she and I split some of these meetings with the FSGG committee, subcommittee members. I think there's definitely interest among the members, and we didn't get any like express objection to the proposal when we were discussing it. I think it's just the vast majority of appropriators have no idea what the bond guarantee program is because it's not funded with an appropriation. So I feel like we're starting almost from square one of explaining what is the program, what is the problem, how would this fix the problem. So I don't think anyone, you know, we don't have especially on the majority side, necessarily an advocate for it at this point. But we also don't have any strong opponents at this point. So I think there is some openness. As with many things in government, it may take more than a year or two to get there. Sophia, did you have any thoughts to add?
Not a whole lot on the House side. I would just say that we've seen a lot of interest, maybe more on the Senate side, with offices, including Republican ones, finding those like individual, like there was a case of Senator Collins's staff being very interested because CEI's CEO had like a very specific case about how BGP wasn't quite working for them. So just to show that we got the attention of that staffer, and we suspect that will definitely make its way to her desk. But
yeah, and that's another plug for individual advocacy having a direct impact. We had talked to that office about the issue before, but it was hearing from a constituent that really kind of perked up their interest. I don't believe, do we have any other questions coming in? A minute or two, and then Tafina, do you want to wrap us up?
Sure. Well, I want to thank our wonderful public policy team for all of their work putting this presentation together. And, you know, just to reiterate that we are available to answer your questions, to talk through ideas, to bring you to DC for in-person Hill visits. We had a couple of years where, we were doing all of our advocacy over Teams and Zoom, and, it really is a lot more fun to actually go to the buildings, like be around the Capitol to talk to people in person. And so we are always wanting to make sure that, you have an open invitation to come to DC and to reach out to us with any of your issues or concerns. We know we're in a very kind of challenging policy environment right now, but just know that we're spending a lot of our time trying to figure out how to put the right resources and information and structures in place to ensure that we can continue to advance the industry's mission and to advance all of our work. So just thank you again for your time, for letting us go a little bit long today. There's a lot to discuss, a lot to talk about. And if you like this format, and if you want to sort of have more of these types of webinars where we're offering kind of useful tools and tips for, advocacy, let us know. We're happy to do more of that, or let us know anything else you'd want to sort of see and hear from the policy team. We always want to make sure that the content we're putting out is relevant to all the work that you're doing. So just thank you all as well for everything that you do on the ground every day. It really does make our jobs that much easier that we can represent everything that you're doing back home while we're here in DC. So I'll just leave it at that and just thank everyone for all of their time. And just once again, we will share the recording and the slides. We will post them. So look out for that in the next day or so. And we hope to see you all soon. Thank you, everybody.